Okay, just got my new book, the first advanced copies, just two of them, from the printer in Korea. So I thought I'd take a minute and show it to you, what you'll be seeing when we get out on tour. It's kind of like a walk around book, but more like an in context book. It's 8.5 by 11, 128 pages, but as you'll see, full color throughout. And you can see it's got this gorgeous action painting on the front of Witchcraft in Action over Europe, in one of those rare night missions they did at the beginning. Let's flip through it real quick and show you a little bit of what's in the book. The book starts out, like I said, trying to give you some context about the B-24 Liberator in terms of how it fit into the war. And of course, to do that, we must start with World War I, which led to World War II. And so I spent a few pages here talking about World War I, the battles, and the aftermath of it, the Versailles Treaty, which wound up with Germany feeling badly dealt by and secretly rearming during the 30s, while America was battling with the Great Depression. Also Japan, which was a country of 70 million people where they were starving, decided it needed the natural resources of China, the mainland, and Manchuria. How the Great Depression kind of took America's focus from the world and put it on itself. And of course, a recession that should have stayed a recession became a depression because of government meddling. In the meantime, the military was downsized to almost nothing. Almost no advances were made in aircraft until the mid to late 30s, when the Boeing B-17 came aboard. From here we move to the Consolidated Aircraft and Reuben Fleet, who started that company, and they are the ones who ended up building the Liberator. Reuben Fleet was instrumental in instigating the U.S. airmail system. At first he built trainers on other people's designs, but soon moved into flying boats and moved his company down to San Diego in California, the most famous of which, of course, is the PBY Catalina. A young engineer named David Davis had a radical idea for an airfoil that was better than anyone else out there, and they used it the first time on the P4Y Corregidor. You begin to see the look that we become to associate with the B-24. From 9 months in 1939, it went from concept to prototype. First flew a couple of days before the end of the war, had a spectacular maiden voyage, and was immediately signed up by the Army Air Force to be the next generation bomber after the Liberator. It ended up being built at 5 factories across the country, and in models from A to N, the most popular, of course, being the D model at first, and then finally the B-24J model, which here's a beautiful skinned version of it. It was painted by my father's cousin, Bob Kemp, for the 50th anniversary of the airplane, in a book by General Dynamics, and they've given us permission to use this picture. From here we move on to World War II and to see what the Liberator did. We start out with Germany reoccupying the Rhineland, which was their factory areas and coal and like that. When they did that and then no one said anything, they continued on where they got Czechoslovakia, and finally, of course, they invaded Poland and the war broke out in late 1939. Just do a page on some of the major events of the capitulation of France, the Winter War up in Finland, the Battle of Britain, the U-boat battles in the Pacific that the Liberator was instrumental in making the Pacific safe for the convoys under Lend-Lease, Barbarossa, which was the Germany's double cross of the USSR, which they struck across the border, opened a two-front war, and basically signed their own death warrant because they couldn't possibly fight two wars. Pearl Harbor, Midway. Now the Liberator starts to appear out in the Pacific, the various different strategies that were used by MacArthur and Nimitz. the famous Lady Be Good plane that overshot its landing in North Africa and went 400 miles inland, and the crew all perished. Some posters of the time, some beautiful color photos of the women who were a huge part of the workforce that built the Liberator. When the Liberator started showing up, it did some pretty heavy lifting in Northern Europe, flew right along with the B-17, but it also had the added dimension of flying in every major theater of the war, including the famous Ploeshti raids in 1943 August, and also the flying the Hump to supply the nationalist Chinese there over the Himalayas. We try to intersperse with a lot of personal stories about the men that flew these things, including the Aleutian battles, which were largely forgotten, but were the first places were liberators who first attacked Japan in the Kuril Islands after Jimmy Doolittle's raid. They were the tip of the spear at D-Day in Europe, and of course they were also out in the Pacific bombing Japan before the B-29s arrived. Here's a few pages of famous crewmen and some who should be famous, including my dad, author's prerogative. Some of the famous liberators, including Superman, that was made famous in the movie about Louis Zamperini, and Hot Stuff, that was the first bomber to complete 25 missions in Europe, but crashed in Iceland on the way home for a Bond tour and was replaced by the B-17 Memphis Belle. The big, wide, and long slab side of the Liberator were natural for nose art, and here I've included some of the more famous and less than famous nose art. From here we turn our attention to the actual airframe that we're currently flying, which saw action in the war in the Indian Ocean and later was used for 20 years by the Indian Air Force. It again found its way into a derelict position where it was purchased by an English investor and then purchased by Dr. Robert Collins. Here's some early pictures prior to its restoration. And then we, the first of three different paint schemes that plane has had, starting with the All-American, then to the Dragon and his tail, maybe the most famous nose or body art of any aircraft of the war. Finally, it wound up being painted as Witchcraft, which was aptly named because it had an almost magical time during the war, flying over 130 missions with no crewman injured or killed. Spectacular statistics. In one of the last sections, we talk about the various crew positions of the aircraft. We go right through everybody's, including my father talking a little bit about what it was like to fly the Liberator. Who was the most important person on board? Certainly wasn't him in his eyes. The navigator was the most important person, and this is their station right at the feet of the pilots. The bombardier and his Norden bomb site. Flight engineer, who was the third member of the cockpit crew, kept an eye on the engines and what he did. The radio operator, as both liaison and communication radios were used with their backups. And then all the turret gunners, nose, top, ball turret, waist gunners, an actual size 50 caliber bullet, and then the loneliest position of the war, in my view, the tail turret gunner. From here we talk a little bit about the survival of the aircraft. It certainly wasn't built for that, and the men had to carry extra oxygen and life rafts and the famous Gibson Girl radio and flak jackets and the like. Rudimentary at best. A little bit about the armors and the bombs and the bomb bay and the power plant, the famous twin Wasp engine, the turbocharger, and some other great period photos that really let us see what it was like to work on the plane back then. The greatest weakness of the aircraft at the beginning was the nose gear. Until they got hardened case bolts to support it, it was a problem with it nosing in. Control surface, the famous split tail, and of course the M on our split tail indicates that aircraft, particular aircraft. They had lettered the aircraft in their squadrons in that group, the 467th. Finally, we let Rob Pinkson talk a little bit about what it was like to fly the plane, and even more importantly, how hard it is to taxi. And then I deal with the ongoing argument as to which is the better airplane, the B-17 or the B-24. Consolidated went on to become General Dynamics and eventually built the Atlas rocket that put the Mercury astronauts into space. Our last section is about the Collins Foundation and their marvelous collection. And that started out with, of course, land vehicles and moved into aircraft. The battle for the airfield, celebrating our visitors, including veterans, that we're losing at such a fast rate. Finally, our crew and how hard they work out on tour, repairing and keeping things moving, all volunteers. Some other great photos of the time of the people that flew this and built this aircraft. And finally, our volunteers, who were all generous enough to send me photos that we could use in the book. Thank you all. Hope your photo appears here. If not, maybe you'll appear in another one of the next either versions of the book or next books that I do. And finally, thank you to Rich Davidson for his beautiful dawn photo of the Witchcraft up there on the East Coast last year. So that's the book. B-24 by the numbers, from the Davis Wing down to the 18,482 built. An amazing aircraft, and one that I'm very proud to celebrate in this book. And thank you.